At the evangelical church in the Libertad neighborhood, everyone always said the same thing about me: Evaristo never misses a service, not even when it's pouring rain or when he has a lot of work at the shop. I had been a deacon of the church for over 10 years, and my reputation was impeccable among the members. My mechanic's shop on Revolution Avenue always closed punctually at 6 p.m., so I wouldn't miss a service. It didn't matter if I had a car in need or a client waiting. My commitment to God came first. At least that's what I thought at that time in my life. During all those years of faith, I witnessed several miracles in our congregation. I saw people being healed of cancer, paralytics walking again, and addicts being freed from drugs. My faith was unwavering, and I truly believed I was on the right path. Pastor Heriberto always publicly praised me, saying I was an example to the other men in the church. My life changed drastically in 2015, when my wife, Esperanza, lost her battle with cancer. Those were difficult months, watching her languish in the hospital bed, praying day and night for healing that never came. Still, my faith remained strong, and I continued to worship faithfully, even if I was alone. Esperanza left me 3 children to raise: Osvaldo, 16, Jimena, 14, and Braulio, just 12. After my wife's death, I immersed myself even more deeply in religious life. It was my way of coping with grief and also a way to show God that I wasn't angry with him. I doubled my prayer schedule, increased my tithe, and dedicated myself even more to church work. Everyone commented on how strong my faith was. Even through the terrible trial, the members of the church always praised me for my dedication and perseverance. Evaristo is a warrior of God, said Sister Florencia of the worship ministry. He is an example of how we should react to adversity. The deacon added to a planner. Those words filled me with pride and made me feel special before God. I was absolutely certain that I was doing everything right in my Christian life. I read the Bible every day, prayed at least 3 times a day, and fasted every Friday. I participated in every possible ministry: evangelism, visiting the sick, Sunday school, and even helping with church maintenance. My schedule was always full of religious commitments. At the workshop, I was known as the evangelical mechanic who didn't work on Sundays. Many customers already knew it wasn't worth their while to seek me out on the Lord's Day because I would be at church. Some even mocked me, saying I was too fanatical, but that didn't bother me. On the contrary, I felt honored to be recognized for my faith in this border city. During services, I always occupied the same position in the 3rd row on the right. It had been my place for years, and everyone already knew that seat belonged to Evaristo. I actively participated in the songs, raised my hands during prayers, and even cried when the Holy Spirit moved in the church. My religious experience was intense and true. Pastor Heriberto frequently used my life as an example in his sermons. Look at Brother Evaristo, he said from the pulpit. He lost his wife, but he didn't lose his faith. Those words touched me deeply and reinforced my conviction that I was pleasing God. I felt like a modern-day Job, tested, but approved by the Almighty. My routine was mathematically perfect: work, home, church, and prayer. There was no room for distractions or worldly pleasures in my life. During the week, when I wasn't at church, I took advantage of the opportunity to read Christian books or listen to sermons online. I truly believed I was living the holiest life possible in this city that everyone knows is on the border, but there was one detail in my life that I considered small and unimportant. My 3 children never accompanied me to services, and I always let them stay home. After all, I thought, forcing someone to go to church isn't God's will, right? How was I wrong about that? After Hope's death, my 3 sons began to rebel against everything that stood for God in our home. Older Osvaldo began getting involved with a group of troubled youths who always hung out near Teniente Guerrero Park. They smoked marijuana, secretly drank beer, and were always picking fights around town. I knew this, but I thought it was just a stage of rebellion over the loss of his mother. The situation became more serious when the police brought Osvaldo home one Friday night. He had been arrested with marijuana in his pocket during a raid on Constitution Avenue. Sergeant Crisanto knew me from the garage and had compassion, releasing my son with only a warning. Osvaldo came home furious, yelling that life had no meaning and that God had abandoned our family. Jimena, my middle daughter, began secretly dating a 25-year-old boy named Rigoberto. I discovered through neighbors that he was selling drugs in the downtown area and had a very bad reputation. When I confronted Jimena about the relationship, she exploded, saying that I only cared about the church and not my own children. Her words hurt me deeply. Little Braulio, who had always been the quietest, completely locked himself away in the world of video games. He spent hours and hours playing online, chatting with strangers on the internet, and isolating himself from the entire family. When I tried to call him to talk or pray together, he would just growl and pretend he didn't hear me. The house was becoming a silent battlefield. Once, Osvaldo surprised me by asking to go to church with me. My heart was filled with joy, thinking he was finally returning to God. But when I saw his condition, disheveled hair, dirty clothes, and smelling of cigarettes, I said something I regret to this day. When you stop that nonsense and get yourself together, then God will accept you into the church. Osvaldo looked at me with terrible pain and never asked me to accompany him again. Pastor Heribata realized something was wrong in my family life. During a pastoral visit to my home, he saw my children's behavior and became very concerned. Evaristo told me seriously, "You need to understand something very important. The blood of these boys will be exacted from your hands if you don't act soon." His words sounded like a prophecy, but I didn't pay them proper attention. I always justified my children's absence from services with excuses that seemed spiritual. "Pastor, I can't force anyone to love God," I told him with conviction. "The heart has to be willing, otherwise it will become hypocrisy." In my mind, I was being wise and respectful of their free will. How I was blind to my true responsibility as a Christian father. During services, when the pastor preached about family and children, I felt uncomfortable. I always found a mental excuse not to apply those words to my situation. My children are different, I thought. They are more rebellious because of the loss of their mother. My pride kept me from seeing that the problem might be with me and my way of handling the situation. The members of the church began to ask about my children more frequently. "Where is Osvaldo Evaristo? Jimena doesn't come to services anymore. Braulio, is he okay?" These questions bothered me because they made me realize that my family was spiritually disintegrated, but instead of acting, I would just smile and quickly change the subject. Jimena went so far as to openly challenge me about my faith. "Dad," she told me during a heated discussion, "if God is so good, why did he let Mom die? Why is our family destroyed?" I didn't know how to respond and just said that I was being used by God. I realize how inadequate my response was and how it further distanced my daughter from God. My children's rebellion. The pressure on my life increased with each passing day. Osvaldo started coming home in the early morning. Jimena began constantly lying about where she was going, and Braulio became completely antisocial. No house rules were respected anymore, and I felt lost, without authority, and unsure how to handle the situation that was spiraling out of control. What I didn't imagine was that my negligence as a spiritual father was about to have far more serious consequences than I could ever imagine. A strange visitor at my doorstep would completely change my perspective on everything and show me how blind I was to the eternal destiny of my own children. It was March 13, 2018, a rainy Tuesday, typical of Tijuana. I had just returned from church and was walking down 5th Street toward my house. The light rain that fell left the streets sparkling in the street lights, and I felt at peace after another night of communion with God. I had no idea that would be the last peaceful night of my life. When I reached the gate of my house, I noticed a strange figure standing right in front of my door. It was an elderly woman dressed entirely in black, with a shawl covering part of her face. She had deep-set, piercing eyes that seemed to see directly into my soul. The most terrifying thing was her hands, covered in scars as if they had been burned by fire. "Good night," I said with some suspicion. "Do you need anything, madam?" She stared at me without blinking and answered with a hoarse, prophetic voice that made my skin crawl. "Your sons will have the same fate as Eli's sons, Evaristo." My blood ran cold upon hearing those words because I knew the biblical story of the sons of the priest Eli very well. I blinked for a second, trying to process what I had just heard. When I opened my eyes again, the woman had disappeared, as if she had never been there. I looked up and down the street, but there was no one, no shadow, nor the sound of footsteps moving away. It was as if he had dissolved into the rainy night air. My neighbor Abundio was coming home from work at that very moment and stopped to chat with me. "Hey, Evaristo. I saw you standing there at the gate." I asked him if he had seen the woman who had been at my door seconds before. Abundio looked at me with a confused expression and said, "What woman, my friend? I didn't see anyone here. Are you okay?" I walked into the house completely disturbed by that supernatural encounter. The woman's words echoed in my mind, "The same fate as Eli's sons." In the Bible, the sons of the priest Eli died in divine judgment because of the father's negligence in correcting them. Could that be a warning from God? Could it be possible that I was making the same mistake as Eli? I tried to calm myself, thinking that maybe it had been just a strange coincidence. After all, old women show up at homes asking for help all the time, don't they? But why did she specifically mention Eli's sons? How did she know my name if I'd never seen her before? And especially how she disappeared like that. I spent the whole night, unable to sleep well, thinking about that sinister prophecy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that woman's face and heard her hoarse voice, repeating those terrible words. Perhaps God was trying to warn me about something I couldn't see. Perhaps my children were truly in spiritual danger. The next morning, I told Sister Remedios, a church intercessor known for having prophetic visions. She became very serious upon hearing my story and said something that left me even more worried. "Brother Evaristo, when God sends supernatural warnings, it's because the situation is very serious. You need to pray and seek the Lord urgently." Over the next few days, I began to observe my children with different A's. Osvaldo continued to arrive late and smell of alcohol. Jimena lied more and more about her outings, and Braulio isolated himself even more in his room. It was possible they were walking toward eternal perdition. The mysterious woman's prophecy began to make more and more sense. I tried to talk to Pastor Heriberto about the strange visit, but he just said I should pray more for my children. "Sometimes God uses supernatural means to get our attention, brother," he explained. "The important thing is that I didn't ignore the message." But I still had no idea how serious my family's situation really was. What I didn't know was that this prophetic visit had been only the first warning of a series of supernatural events that would completely shake my life. A night of terror was approaching, a night that would forever change my understanding of parenthood, spiritual responsibility, and the eternal destiny of the souls God had placed under my care. Exactly 10 days had passed since that strange visit from the mysterious woman. It was March 23, 2018, a Thursday that began like any other. I worked normally at the shop. I went to church for prayer and returned home around 10 p.m. I ate dinner alone because my children had already eaten and were each in their own corner of the house. I went to bed at 11:30 after saying my usual prayer and reading a chapter from the Bible. I was tired from the day's work and fell asleep quickly in my bed. Osvaldo had gone out with friends, Ximena was in her room listening to music, and Braulio was playing video games in the living room. Everything seemed normal until something very strange began to happen. I woke up abruptly at 3:33 a.m. I remember the exact time because I looked at the digital clock on the nightstand. I felt an icy chill take over the room, as if someone had turned on a powerful air conditioner in the middle of winter. It was a chill that seemed to come from my bones, unlike anything I'd ever felt in my life. The most terrifying thing was that my late wife's houseplants, which were by the bedroom window, had wilted instantly. The ferns, the violets, the begonias, everything that had been green and leafy when I went to sleep, now seemed to have been absorbed by some sinister force. It was as if life itself had been drained from them in a matter of seconds. Suddenly, a terrible smell began to fill the air. It was a stench of sulfur mixed with something rotten, like the smell of rotten eggs burning. The stench was so strong that it made me nauseous and I began to have difficulty breathing. I had never smelled such a repugnant and unearthly smell in my life. It was then that I heard a deep, threatening voice whispering right in my left ear. "Negligent father," the voice said in a tone that chilled my blood, "your time has come to see the fate of your children." The words seemed to come from someone standing right next to my bed, but when I looked, I couldn't. There was no one there. I tried to get out of bed, but my body was completely paralyzed. It was as if an invisible force was pressing me down against the mattress, preventing any movement. I could only move my eyes and breathe heavily. Panic gripped me because I realized this wasn't a dream, it was happening for real. The voice continued speaking, now with more authority and anger. "You received a warning 10 days ago and ignored it. Now you will see with your own eyes what happens to parents who neglect their children's safety." The tone was like a final judgment, as if there was no turning back. My heart raced with fear. The room began to darken even more, even with the light from the streetlight streaming in through the window. It was an unearthly darkness that seemed to swallow everything around it. I felt a very strong evil presence in the air, as if demons were surrounding my bed. The air became heavy and suffocating. I began to pray desperately in my mind because my mouth couldn't move. "Lord Jesus, protect me, in the name of Jesus, remove this suppression from me." But the prayers seemed to have no effect. It was as if an invisible barrier was preventing my words from reaching heaven. I had never felt so spiritually helpless. The cold continued to increase, and now I could see my own breath forming steam in the air. The walls of the room seemed to pulse as if they had a life of their own. Objects began to vibrate slightly, the mirror, the paintings, even the bed where I was lying. It was a real demonic manifestation happening in my own room. Then, the voice spoke one last time before what would come next. "Prepare yourself, Evaristo, you are going to know where your children are headed because of your inaction." At that moment, I felt as if my soul was being violently ripped from my body, and a terrifying journey into the depths was about to begin. Suddenly, I found myself floating above my own bed, looking down and seeing my physical body lying completely motionless. It was the strangest experience of my life. I was conscious and could think normally, but I was outside of my body. I felt as if my soul had been violently ripped from my flesh, as if someone had ripped me from within myself with brutal force. Two shadowy beings appeared beside me, each grabbing one of my spiritual arms. They had human form, but were completely dark and emanated an aura of terrible evil. I couldn't see their faces clearly, only threatening silhouettes that escorted me wordlessly. I tried to resist, but I had no strength against them. We began to move across the roof of the house, passing through the shingles as if we were smoke. I saw my bedroom moving away, then my entire house on 5th Street becoming smaller below. The fine rain that was still falling passed through my spiritual body without wetting me. It was a strange sensation of being there, but at the same time not being there. As we climbed, I could see the entire city of Tijuana spread out below us. I saw the evangelical church where I worshipped, the main plaza, my workshop on Revolution Avenue, all the familiar places of my life. I thought to myself, will this be the last time I see these places? Will I die and leave my children orphaned? We continued climbing until the lights of the city became like tiny bright dots far below. Soon, even those dots disappeared completely, and we entered total darkness. It was a black and terrifying void, with no stars, no moon, no visual references, just absolute nothingness around us. Then we began to descend, and the descent was much faster and more terrifying than the ascent. It was as if we were falling into a bottomless pit, descending a dark tunnel that seemed to run through the center of the earth. The unearthly wind cut into my face, and I could hear distant sounds, moans, screams, and wails coming from somewhere deep within. During the endless descent, I began to feel the heat gradually increasing. At first, it was only a gentle warmth, like a hot summer day. Then, it grew more intense, as if we were approaching a furnace, gigantic. The air began to become heavy and stifling, filled with smoke and toxic fumes. The sounds of suffering grew louder and clearer as we descended. They were human voices screaming in pain, pleading for help, crying in despair. thousands upon thousands of voices mingling in a terrible symphony of agony. My heart sank because I began to realize where we were going, and it wasn't a good place. The temperature continued to rise until it became unbearable. It was like being inside a burning furnace with waves of heat attacking my spiritual body from all sides. My skin began to burn even without visible flames. Sweat trickled down my face, but evaporated instantly due to the extreme heat. Finally, after what seemed like hours of terrifying descent, we reached the final destination of our journey. It was a place I knew from the Bible, but I never imagined I would see with my own eyes, a place of eternal torment that truly exists, not just as a symbol or metaphor. Hell was real, and I was about to set foot there. What I saw when we arrived down there shocked me more than all the biblical descriptions I had read over the years. It wasn't just fire and brimstone, it was a whole dimension of suffering, with landscapes of despair stretching as far as I could see, a parallel reality of eternal torture that made Tijuana seem like paradise. As my feet touched the burning ground of that terrible place, a question hammered in my mind: why was God bringing me here? What was the purpose of this visit to hell? The answer would come soon, and it would be more devastating than I could ever imagine. When my feet touched the floor of hell, the first thing that hit me was the unbearable heat rising from the ground. It was like stepping on red-hot coal, but thousands of times more intense. The second impact was the smell, a nauseating mix of burning flesh, rotten sewage, and sulfur that made me gag. It was a stench that penetrated the soul and seemed to stick in the throat. The place stretched endlessly in all directions, like a burning plain covered in fire and black smoke. There was no sky, only a ceiling of dark clouds that seemed made of ash and blood. The only sources of light were the flames bursting from the ground and the lakes of fire scattered across the landscape. It was more real than Tijuana, more real than anything I had ever experienced on Earth. The screams were deafening, millions of human voices crying for help, pleading for water, crying out in pain and despair. It was a sound that cut to the soul and made me want to cover my ears, but the noise penetrated anyway. I realized that those weren't the screams of imaginary people. They were the real souls of people who had once lived on Earth and were now trapped there forever. It was then that I began to recognize some voices among the tormented crowd. One of them chilled my blood. It was Silvano, a 20-year-old young man who died of an overdose the year before near Teniente Guerrero Park. He had sought me out months before his death, asking for help and wanting to go to church with me. I told him that first he needed to quit drugs and then seek God. Evaristo, shouted Silvano among the flames. Do you remember me? I asked you to take me to church. You said I wasn't ready. His words pierced me like a spear to the chest. I saw now that my response at that moment had been completely wrong. I could have been an instrument of salvation for that boy, but I chose to judge instead of love. I walked a few more meters and heard another familiar voice. It was Beatrice, a 25-year-old woman who worked at the beauty salon near my studio. She had also tragically died in a motorcycle accident and was now there, burning eternally. Evaristo wept. How many times have I passed by your studio, wanting to talk about God, but you were always too busy. The most terrifying thing was yet to come. The two shadowy beings who brought me there pushed me toward a specific area of hell, where the heat was even more intense. It was as if we were approaching the center of a cosmic furnace. The flames there weren't red like ordinary fire. They were blue and white, indicating extreme temperatures. It was at that moment that I had the vision. The most devastating experience of my life. In a supernatural projection before my eyes, I saw my 3 children being dragged to that same place by horrible demons. Osvaldo died in a motorcycle crash on the highway at 21, completely drunk and high. Jimena died of an overdose at 19 in the same apartment where she sold her body to support her habit. Fraulio committed suicide at 25, hanging himself in his own room, overcome by depression and isolation. The vision was so real that I could smell the burning tires from Osvaldo's accident, see Jimena's tears as the drugs stopped her heart, and hear Braulio's last breath before tightening the rope around his neck. They were premature and terrible deaths, But the worst part was seeing the three of them being taken to hell for having rejected God during their short lives on earth. In the vision, I saw my children arriving at that place of torment and desperately searching for me in the flames. "Dad!" they shouted at me, "why didn't you bring us Jesus? Why did you let us choose the wrong path? Now we are lost forever, and it's your fault." Their accusations were like daggers being driven into my heart. The most terrible thing was realizing they were right. As a father and as a Christian, I had the responsibility to guide my children on the path of salvation. But I chose comfort, spiritual pride, and the false spirituality of appearing holy in the church, while completely neglecting the souls God had placed under my care. I was guilty, and now I saw the eternal consequences of my omission. I recognized Silvano shouting my name from the flames. "Evaristo, didn't you take me to church when I asked you to?" His words echoed like a divine accusation that tore at my soul. I realized how many opportunities I had missed to be an instrument of salvation for the people around me in Tijuana. Negligence affected not only my children, but all those who looked to me for a spiritual answer. While I was still processing the terrible sight of my children being brought to hell, a blinding light pierced the darkness around me. It was a different light than the flames burning everywhere. It was a pure, white, and powerful light that made even the demons at my side recoil in fear. I knew it was the presence of God Himself manifesting in that place of torment. The voice that echoed afterward made all of hell shake as if it were an earthquake. It was no longer the whispered, threatening voice I had heard in the room. It was the majestic and terrifying voice of the Creator of the universe speaking in holy wrath. "Evaristus," thundered the divine voice, "you have failed completely as a spiritual father. I am going to show you exactly what your responsibility is." Immediately, scenes from my life began to flash before my eyes like a fast forward to the movie. I saw all the times my children tried to reach out to me spiritually and I rejected them. Osvaldo asking to go to church and me humiliating him for his appearance. Jimena asking questions about God and me responding with religious coldness. Braulio wanting to talk and me always busy with church matters. "Your children are lost because of your negligence," the Lord declared in a voice that made all of hell fall silent in terror. "I placed those three souls under your care, and you chose to be a Christian of appearances instead of a father after my own heart. Now see the consequences of your spiritual omission." The voice of God continued to confront me, with a devastating truth. "You spent 18 years attending church, but never led your children to a true knowledge of Jesus. You were a deacon, but failed as a father. You fasted and prayed, but you let your own seeds be lost forever. What good is it to gain the approval of men if you lost your own family?" That's when God showed me the brutal difference between religiosity and responsible spiritual parenting. "Evaristo, I didn't call you just to be an exemplary member of the church. I called you to be a priest of your own home, to lead your children to my feet." You transformed your faith into the religious social club and forgot the Great Commission that begins at home. Divine accusation continued to destroy me inside. "How many times Pastor Heriberto warned you? How many times have I spoken to your heart during services about your children? But you were too busy building your religious reputation to hear my voice. Now your children will pay eternally for your spiritual pride." God forced me to see in cruel detail what the death of each of my children would be like. Osvaldo crashing his motorcycle on the curve of the Ensenada highway at 120 km per hour, completely altered by drugs, dying instantly with his skull shattered. Shimona convulsing alone in a dirty room, with a syringe still stuck in her arm. As her heart stopped beating at 19, the most painful vision was Braulio's. I saw my youngest son at 25, completely isolated from the world, tying a rope to the room's fan and putting his neck inside the loop. I saw the despair in his eyes, the feeling of total abandonment, the certainty that no one loved him, not even the father, who should have been his example of faith and hope. These deaths could have been avoided if you had fulfilled your role as a Christian father. The divine voice thundered, "But you preferred to be admired in church to being respected at home. You preferred empty religiosity to responsible fatherhood. Now see the price of your negligence. 3 eternal souls lost because of your spiritual selfishness." God continued his relentless judgment. In Tijuana, a border city full of dangers and temptations, your children needed more than ever a father to protect them spiritually, but you were more concerned about your image in the congregation than about the souls under your roof. You chose to be religious in public and negligent in private. God's final judgment on my life was like a death sentence. Evaristo, the blood of your children is on your hands. You had 18 years to lead them to me, but you chose to hide behind a false holiness. Now you will experience the torment they will experience so that you understand exactly what your omission cost. At that moment, I felt my spiritual body being pushed into the most intense flames of hell. The time had come to experience firsthand the eternal suffering that awaited my children, all because of my negligence as a Christian father. The torment was about to begin. The moment I was thrust into the flames was the most terrifying of my existence. It was like being submerged in a pool of molten iron that burned every inch of my soul. The pain was indescribable. Imagine 1,000 red-hot needles being shoveled simultaneously into every pore of your skin, multiplied by 1,000,000. It was a suffering beyond any human endurance. The most desperate thing was that even burning intensely, my spiritual body was never completely consumed. It was an eternal cycle of destruction and regeneration to suffer again. The spiritual flesh melted and I rebuilt in a split second only to be burned again. It was the perfect definition of endless torment. During those endless hours of agony, the faces of my 3 children constantly appeared in the same flames that tortured me. I saw Osvaldo's face accusing me amid the blazes. "Dad, you could have saved me from this," Jimena cried in the midst of the fire. "Why did you let me choose the wrong path?" And little Braulio screamed desperately, "You preferred church to your own children." I tried to scream for forgiveness, but my voice was lost in the deafening noise of millions of other souls in torment. It was like trying to speak in the middle of a hurricane. The words simply dissolved in the superheated air. The despair of not being able to even express my regret further increased my psychological agony. The most painful memories of my life played repeatedly through my mind as I burned. I remembered every Sunday my children asked to stay home and I simply allowed it, relieved not to have to drag them to church. I remembered every missed opportunity to converse about Jesus, every moment I chose to be religious instead of being a parent. The guilt was more torturing than the flames themselves. I realized now how selfish I had been in my faith. I used God to feel special, admired, and respected in the congregation, but completely neglected my role as a priest in my own home. I had been a showcase Christian, pretty on the outside, but completely fake on the inside. Amid the screams of agony, I began to understand the depth of my error. God didn't call me to be a solitary saint. He called me to be a father who leads the entire family heavenward. My individual salvation meant nothing if I lost the souls he had placed under my direct responsibility. The physical pain was unbearable, but the emotional pain was even worse. I knew my children were rapidly moving toward that same terrible fate, and I was solely responsible for it. Every wrong decision I made as a parent, every spiritual omission, every moment of religious pride had contributed to their eternal doom. During the torment, I constantly heard the cries of the other lost souls around me, fathers who had failed like me, mothers who neglected their children's spiritual education, religious leaders who cared more for their own reputations than for the sheep in their care. It was a hellish chorus of repentance that came too late. Time in hell doesn't exist the way it does on earth. Those hours of suffering felt like decades of agony. Every second stretched like an eternity. Every moment of pain multiplied infinitely. It was like experiencing the slow death of 1,000 people at the same time, never able to rest or faint. Thirst was another terrible torment. My throat burned as if I had swallowed ground glass mixed with salt. I begged for a single drop of water, but I knew it would never come. I remembered the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, where the rich man